In the closing months of World War II, a quiet revolution unfolded not on a battlefield, but in the minds of those who had grown up inside one of history's most powerful propaganda machines. Imagine being told, day after day, that the enemy was a monster. From schoolbooks to radio broadcasts, every story warned that the Americans were brutal invaders, driven by chaos and hatred. For years, young German women serving as military auxiliaries known as Helferinnen were certain that the approaching Allied soldiers would be their worst nightmare. But when the long-feared encounter finally came, the reality was nothing like the frightening tales they had been fed. Instead of violence, they witnessed an unexpected scene. Soldiers unloading crates not of weapons, but of food and medicine. Instead of the vicious cruelty promised by Nazi leaders, there was a quiet, almost effortless kindness. For many of these women, the shock was immediate and overwhelming. If the enemy they had been taught to fear turned out to be generous and disciplined, what else had been a lie? This is the story of how an entire belief system, carefully built over years of manipulation, began to crumble in a single, unforgettable moment. It is a story of human resilience, of discovering truth in the most surprising ways, and of how simple acts of compassion can shatter even the strongest walls of deception. From a single bar of chocolate handed to a hungry child, to the sight of soldiers who treated their captives with dignity, these experiences forced the Helferinnen to question everything they thought they knew. Join us as we journey back to 1945, to the heart of a defeated Germany, where the quiet power of generosity proved more transformative than any weapon. This is not just a tale of history, it is a reminder for our own time that kindness and truth can outlast fear and lies. If you find this story as compelling as we do not forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a powerful look into the past. Your support helps us share more remarkable true stories that continue to shape the way we understand our world today. The first thing that struck the young German auxiliaries as they stepped into the American-controlled zone was not the sound of commands or the presence of armed guards, but the startling abundance that surrounded them. For years, they had lived in a world of shortages and quiet desperation, where every scrap of bread was rationed and every pair of boots was worn until the leather gave way. The war had stripped their country bare, cities lay in ruins, streets were filled with rubble, and families queued for hours to receive meager portions of food. The Nazi regime had told them that the Allies were suffering too, that enemy soldiers were hungry and desperate, that any victory they achieved was built on chaos and poverty. Yet here, in the aftermath of surrender, those stories dissolved like smoke. The Americans seemed to inhabit another reality entirely. In their camps, food was plentiful and effortlessly shared. The scent of hot coffee and fresh bread wafted through the air like a promise of a world these women had never known. Soldiers casually handed out chocolate bars, a luxury most of the young women had not seen in years, and the sweet, rich taste lingered as something almost otherworldly. To them, chocolate had become a distant memory, a relic of childhood before the war took everything familiar. Now it was offered freely, without suspicion or demand, and that single gesture cut deeper than any fiery speech could have. It revealed not only the falsehood of Nazi warnings, but also the sheer difference between what they had been taught and what stood in front of them. Medicine, too, was in ready supply. Clean bandages, antiseptics, and pills were stocked as though disease and injury were temporary inconveniences rather than daily battles for survival. The women, accustomed to hospitals stripped of even basic necessities, could hardly believe their eyes at the neat shelves filled with supplies. Even the discarded boots, items the Americans deemed too worn for further use, were in better condition than the pairs the women had been wearing for years. In their world, such boots would have been carefully repaired, patched again and again until they nearly fell apart. To see soldiers toss them aside as if they were nothing more than clutter was almost incomprehensible. Cleanliness itself became a revelation. The Americans maintained bathing facilities and sanitation practices that spoke of a culture untouched by the grinding deprivation that had become ordinary in Germany. Hot showers and soap seemed like small luxuries. Yet to the Helferinnen, they were striking symbols of a life where dignity was preserved even in the midst of war. These details, mundane to the soldiers who lived with them every day, stood as silent evidence of a society thriving beyond the reach of Nazi control. With each passing hour, the contrast grew sharper. The women remembered how propaganda had warned of barbaric invaders who would plunder and destroy. Yet the Americans behaved with a discipline and calm efficiency that undermined every threat they had heard. Their wealth was not only material, it was the wealth of organization, of a nation whose strength came from its ability to provide for its people even in distant battlefields. The simple sight of soldiers who could spare chocolate and medicine while fighting a global war made the endless speeches of Nazi superiority sound hollow and absurd. For the young auxiliaries, these moments were not just surprises but profound revelations. They began to see that the stories fed to them since childhood had been carefully constructed illusions. They had been told the Allies were starving, that their armies were barely holding together, that Germany's enemies were desperate marauders who would bring ruin and cruelty. Yet the men they now met carried themselves with an ease and generosity that exposed those warnings as nothing more than fear-driven lies. The very existence of such abundance of goods, of health, of simple kindness proved that the outside world was not as dark and dangerous as they had been led to believe. Each small interaction, an offered cup of coffee, a pair of boots pressed into grateful hands, a soldier patiently translating instructions for medical care, was like a stone dropped into the still waters of their beliefs, sending ripples through years of indoctrination. These were not isolated incidents, but a steady stream of evidence that the life they had been promised by their leaders was built on falsehood. It was not the force of Allied weapons that shattered their faith in the regime, but the quiet, undeniable reality of what they saw and tasted and touched. As the days passed, the shock gave way to contemplation. If the Americans, portrayed as the embodiment of chaos and brutality, could live with such order and generosity, what else had been distorted? The question lingered in every conversation, in every thoughtful glance exchanged between the women. Their world, once so certain and defined by the rigid lines of Nazi ideology, began to feel fragile and uncertain, and in that uncertainty there was an opening, an invitation to step beyond the narrow horizon they had known and to imagine a life not bound by fear and lies. This meeting of two worlds did not merely mark the end of a war. It signaled the collapse of an entire system of deception. The material wealth of the use, troops, chocolate, medicine, clean facilities, even discarded boots was more than a collection of comforts. It became a living proof that truth, when finally seen, has the power to unmake even the most carefully constructed myths. If the abundance of food, medicine, and simple comforts had already shaken the young German auxiliaries' trust in the stories they had been fed, the next revelation reached even deeper, striking at the very core of the ideology they had grown up with. For years, the Nazi regime had preached a rigid hierarchy of race and gender, declaring that so-called pure German blood ensured superiority, and that women were destined to serve only as caretakers of home and family. Those beliefs had been repeated so often in classrooms, in rallies, in every poster and radio broadcast that they felt like the unshakable truth of the world. Yet in the American camps, where these women now found themselves as prisoners and witnesses, the reality unfolded before their eyes in a way that could not be explained away or ignored. Among the soldiers who guarded the camps and moved supplies were men whose very presence defied the Nazi worldview. African American servicemen, wearing the same uniforms and carrying the same authority as any other member of the U.S. Army. The women had been taught that people of darker skin were inferior, that they lacked the discipline, education, and courage required for leadership. But these soldiers stood with the same posture of command as their white counterparts, their movements precise and confident, their voices firm and steady. They were not the caricatures that Nazi propaganda had painted. Instead, they embodied professionalism and quiet strength, showing no trace of the weakness or chaos the German regime had claimed would be inevitable in a society that embraced racial diversity. The sight of them in uniform, commanding respect and performing their duties with skill, forced the young women to confront a reality that no speech could refute. Equally unsettling to their old beliefs was the role of American women in the occupying forces. The auxiliaries had been raised to believe that a woman's highest purpose was to serve the home, to support the ambitions of men, and to accept her position as secondary. Yet here were American women nurses, clerks, officers moving through the camp with a natural authority that seemed almost startling. They gave instructions to soldiers, managed medical operations, and made decisions without hesitation. Their confidence was not brash or performative. It was the quiet assurance of people who knew their place was earned and secure. To the German women who had lived under a system that prized their obedience above all else, the simple fact of seeing women command respect in a military setting was nothing short of revolutionary. The interactions were not grand speeches or formal debates, but small, unmistakable moments that carried the weight of truth. An African-American soldier offering guidance with the same steady voice as any officer. An American nurse calmly directing both men and women with unquestioned authority. A female driver stepping down from a jeep and discussing logistics with soldiers as equals, each scene pressed against the walls of indoctrination that the German women had carried for years. They could feel their old certainties bending under the strain of what they were witnessing. The propaganda that had once seemed so powerful suddenly looked fragile, like glass cracking under the first touch of reality. As days passed, the women found themselves returning to these encounters in quiet conversations. Some spoke in hushed tones about the dignity and discipline of the African-American soldiers, their presence a living contradiction of every racial myth they had been taught. Others remarked with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment on the American women who navigated their roles with such poise and authority. It was not merely curiosity, but the recognition of something fundamentally different. Something that hinted at a world beyond the narrow roles and rigid hierarchies of their upbringing. The very existence of these people in positions of respect revealed that the structure of society did not have to rest on the divisions that Nazism had claimed were natural and inevitable. The auxiliaries began to see that the boundaries their leaders had drawn between races and genders were not truths but weapons of control. The Nazi regime had insisted that a society without strict racial purity would collapse into weakness and disorder, that women who sought influence beyond the family would bring ruin. Yet here, before their eyes, stood living proof that diversity and equality did not weaken a nation. They strengthened it. The American Army, with its range of backgrounds and its inclusion of women in meaningful roles, operated with a discipline and effectiveness that Germany's so-called pure forces had failed to maintain. This realization was both disorienting and liberating. For years, these women had been told who they were and what their future must be. Now they saw possibilities that their leaders had deliberately hidden from them. If men of different races could stand as equals, if women could lead and be respected, then perhaps the world was far wider and richer than the narrow vision they had been given. The lies that once defined their identity began to lose their hold, replaced by the quiet, undeniable understanding that human worth is not dictated by race or gender but proven through character and action. The encounters with African-American soldiers and confident American women did not merely challenge the Nazi narrative. They dismantled it. These moments revealed that strength is not born from exclusion, but from inclusion. That dignity is not the privilege of one race or gender, but a shared human right. In the silence of those days, amid the sound of distant repairs, the hum of military order, and the soft rustle of new possibilities, an entire ideology crumbled, not under the force of weapons, but under the unshakable power of reality. By the time the young German auxiliaries had adjusted to the shock of American abundance and the presence of soldiers and women who shattered the racial and gender myths they had been taught, another, deeper realization began to take shape. It was not just the soldiers' kindness or the quiet authority of American women that unsettled their old beliefs, but the unmistakable evidence of a nation whose power was built on something far more enduring than fear. All around them, the sheer scale of America's industrial strength and the precision of its organization revealed a reality that made the Nazi portrayal of the United States as decadent and weak seem almost laughable. For years they had been told that America was a nation of reckless excess, a society too spoiled and chaotic to fight with discipline. Nazi leaders insisted that beneath the surface of American wealth there was only moral decay and softness, that a people devoted to comfort and pleasure could never stand firm in a long war. These claims had been repeated so often that they had become part of the mental landscape of every German citizen, accepted not as opinion but as fact. Yet here, in the aftermath of defeat, the women found themselves surrounded by a different kind of proof, one that could not be dismissed as Allied propaganda. The evidence was visible in every truck that rumbled past, in every carefully packed crate of supplies, in the silent efficiency with which the Americans rebuilt what war had broken. The camps where the women were held were models of order. Roads were cleared, tents erected in neat rows, kitchens and medical stations set up with a speed that was almost unsettling. Nothing felt improvised or temporary. Even in an occupied country thousands of miles from home, the Americans operated as if they carried with them the resources of an entire continent, and in many ways they did. The flow of equipment seemed endless, vehicles gleaming with maintenance, machinery that worked without pause, supplies that arrived exactly when needed. For young women who had watched their own cities starve for fuel and food, who had seen German factories crumble under Allied bombing, this level of sustained production was almost unimaginable. They had lived through the slow unraveling of the Third Reich's economy, through winters when coal was scarce and the simplest goods became impossible to find. They had queued for bread and watched families trade heirlooms for a few pounds of potatoes. Their leaders had explained these hardships as the price of a noble struggle, claiming that the Allies were suffering just as much, that America's industrial heart was already faltering under the weight of its own corruption. But the Americans who now occupied their homeland gave no sign of exhaustion. Instead, they moved with a calm assurance that spoke of a country whose factories were not only intact but thriving, a nation that could send tanks, planes, trucks, and food across an ocean without draining its own reserves. Even the smallest details carried meaning. The uniforms of the American soldiers were clean and well fitted, their boots polished, their weapons well cared for. Their vehicles, from jeeps to heavy transports, ran smoothly and were replaced or repaired without hesitation. To the German auxiliaries, these were not trivial observations but powerful symbols. They revealed an economy so vast and well coordinated that war had not drained it dry. In contrast, Germany's own forces had been patching equipment with whatever scraps could be found, its soldiers often wearing threadbare uniforms and boots long past repair. As the women watched this quiet demonstration of capability, they began to understand that the very foundation of Nazi propaganda had been built on falsehoods. The claim that America was decadent, that it lacked the discipline and strength to sustain a global conflict, collapsed in the face of such visible evidence. The United States had not only fought a war on two fronts, but had done so while maintaining a standard of living and an industrial output that dwarfed anything the Reich could imagine. Its strength was not the brittle hardness of a regime sustained by fear. It was the enduring power of a society that could mobilize its people and its factories without destroying its own vitality. The realization spread slowly but firmly among the auxiliaries. They spoke of it in quiet moments, comparing the ruins of their own cities to the endless stream of American supplies. Some admitted their shock openly, others merely shook their heads in silence. But all could see that the Nazi leaders had lied. What they had been told was weakness was, in truth, an unshakable strength. What they had been told was decadence was in fact the ability to produce and organize on a scale their own nation could not match. This recognition did more than undermine their faith in the regime. It redefined their understanding of what power could mean. They began to see that true strength did not come from terror or rigid ideology, but from a system capable of balancing freedom with discipline, wealth with responsibility, abundance with purpose. The Americans had proved that a nation could be both prosperous and resilient, that it could fight a massive war and still preserve the comfort and dignity of its people. By the time the auxiliaries left the camps, the image of the United States that Nazi propaganda had worked so hard to create had been replaced by something far more real and far more humbling. America's immense industrial output and the smooth, organized efficiency of its military machine had exposed the weakness of every claim the regime had made. The truth was undeniable. The power of a free and industrious society had defeated the illusions of superiority and decay, leaving behind a lesson that would echo long after the last shots of the war were fired. When the war finally released its grip and the women were allowed to return to their shattered hometowns, they carried with them more than the meager belongings they had managed to keep through captivity. They carried memories that refused to fade, moments of unexpected generosity, sights and sounds that had cracked open the world they thought they knew. Yet as they crossed familiar streets lined with rubble and passed neighbors whose faces were hardened by loss, they discovered that their experiences in the American camps were not easily shared. Germany in defeat was a landscape of hunger and humiliation, and in that atmosphere of grief their words sounded almost like betrayal. The women had witnessed a side of the enemy that few at home could imagine. They had tasted chocolate freely offered by the very soldiers they were taught to fear. They had watched American nurses and female officers manage men and resources with calm authority. They had seen African American soldiers, so often vilified in Nazi rhetoric, stand with quiet confidence and command respect. They had observed the immense, almost effortless power of American industry and the steady rhythm of an army that seemed immune to exhaustion. These images were burned into their minds as clearly as the ruins of their own cities. But when they spoke of them, they found their stories greeted with doubt or even hostility. Neighbors who had spent years under relentless bombing raids and rationing, who had buried sons and brothers, were in no mood to hear about the kindness of their conquerors. For many Germans, the war's end had brought no sense of relief, only the bitter taste of defeat and the daily struggle for survival. Food was scarce, homes were lost, and the future was a fog of uncertainty. In such a climate, the suggestion that American soldiers had shown generosity or that life in the camps had revealed a different kind of strength was almost unbearable. It seemed to some like an attempt to diminish their suffering or to excuse the enemy's victory. The returning auxiliaries quickly learned to measure their words. Some tried to describe the organized efficiency they had seen, the endless flow of supplies that exposed the weakness of Nazi claims about a decadent United States. They tried to explain how their encounters with African American soldiers and confident American women had dismantled the racial and gender hierarchies that had shaped their upbringing. But more often than not they were met with tight-lipped silence or a swift change of subject. Friends who had lost loved ones could not easily accept that the enemy might have shown compassion. Parents who had endured years of propaganda and then the humiliation of surrender were not ready to hear that their former adversaries might be capable of fairness or decency. In the weeks and months that followed, Some of these women began to keep their memories to themselves. They understood that their testimony, though true, clashed with the narrative of bitterness that surrounded them. To speak openly was to risk being accused of disloyalty or naivety. So they buried their stories beneath the daily work of rebuilding homes and finding food, even as the images of American order and generosity continued to shape their private thoughts. For those who had been deeply marked by what they had seen, silence was both a protection and a burden. In quiet moments they recalled the smell of hot coffee in the American kitchens, the steady voices of soldiers who treated them not as conquered enemies but as fellow human beings, the sight of women in uniform commanding respect without question. These memories refused to fade even when unspoken, challenging the despair that hung over post-war Germany like a heavy fog. Over time, the contrast between their inner understanding and the bitterness around them became impossible to ignore. The women who had once believed in the promises of Nazi propaganda had not only survived the collapse of their nation's ideology, but had witnessed the living proof of a different kind of power, one rooted in generosity, discipline, and the quiet strength of a society that thrived on inclusion and cooperation. They could not unsee what they had seen, and even when silence seemed the only safe choice, their private knowledge became a quiet act of resistance against the hatred and suspicion that lingered. Years later, when Germany began to confront its past more openly, some of these women would finally speak about those days. They would describe how the enemy they had been taught to fear had offered them food, medicine, and a glimpse of a world where race and gender did not define worth. They would explain how America's immense industrial power and calm efficiency had shattered the illusion of Allied weakness. And they would confess how difficult it had been to return home to a country too wounded to hear such truths. In their own way, these women carried a hidden history, a story not of battles and strategies but of quiet revelations and the slow dismantling of lies. Their memories were not a denial of the suffering Germany endured, but a reminder that even in the aftermath of war, humanity and generosity can pierce the darkest propaganda. Though many kept their experiences locked inside for years, the truths they carried helped prepare the ground for a Germany that would one day face its past with clearer eyes. And in the silence of those early post-war days, when disbelief and suspicion surrounded them, their unspoken memory stood as a quiet, enduring testimony to the power of reality over ideology. In the end, the journey of these young German women stands as a quiet but undeniable testament to the way truth reveals itself not through political speeches or clever arguments, but through the simple force of lived experience. They had entered the American camps as products of years of carefully engineered indoctrination. Every lesson of their youth had been designed to convince them that the outside world was dangerous and corrupt, that the enemies of Germany were savage and morally bankrupt, and that their nation alone carried the mantle of strength and purity. Yet the days and weeks that followed their capture told a different story, not in grand gestures or sweeping declarations, but in the ordinary, human details that no propaganda could erase. They had expected brutality and found generosity. They had been warned of chaos and discovered order. They had been taught that the United States was a place of weakness and decadence, only to witness a level of industrial power and organizational skill that Germany, even at its height, could never match. They had been told that race defined worth, yet they saw African American soldiers serving with the same authority and dignity as any other. They had been told that women belonged only in the home, yet they watched American women direct men and manage operations with calm confidence. Each of these moments was like a crack in the wall of falsehood that had enclosed their world, and once the light began to enter, there was no way to seal it again. This transformation did not require the Americans to debate Nazi ideology or to distribute leaflets denouncing Hitler's lies. It required only that they live their own truth, sharing food when others were starving, maintaining discipline and fairness when hatred might have seemed easier. and demonstrating, simply by the way they organize their lives, that strength does not come from cruelty or racial hierarchy, but from unity and mutual respect. For the women who witnessed it, no argument could have been more powerful. It was the steady rhythm of everyday reality that dismantled the towering myths of authoritarian rule. When these women returned to their devastated homeland, they carried memories that would stay with them for a lifetime. They could not always speak openly of what they had seen, for their country was still deep in grief and resentment. But the truth lived quietly within them. Over the years, as Germany struggled to rebuild and confront the weight of its own past, their experiences offered a different kind of lesson, one that would grow more valuable with time. They had learned that the most enduring challenge to an oppressive ideology is not a louder voice of opposition, but the quiet, undeniable presence of a better way of life. That lesson is as relevant now as it was in the shadow of World War II. In every age, when falsehoods spread and fear threatens to divide, it is the witness of reality, of fairness, kindness, and the steady proof that freedom can produce both prosperity and discipline that speaks with the greatest force. These women's lives remind us that even the strongest walls of propaganda can be undone by the simple experience of seeing the truth with one's own eyes. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a lesser-known chapter of history. If you found this story meaningful, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing to our channel, and turning on the notification bell so you never miss the next exploration of the past. Your engagement helps us bring more powerful stories of human courage, hidden truths, and the enduring strength of reality over ideology to audiences everywhere.